A little bit about our company and what we do. We try to figure out what's going on in the housing market for people. We've got 70 people devoted nothing to that, offices around the country. Most of the major home builders work with us. The fastest growing part of our business is actually the remodeling business now too, so we know that side of the industry well. And what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to give you our view on what we think is going on in the housing market from a demographic standpoint. So I'm going to stand here so I can see the screen. So in 2013, the economy was coming, a little too loud? Try that. Okay. The economy was coming back, but the housing market wasn't quite coming back like we all thought it would. And there was one more millennial excuse after another as to why things weren't going well. So what do these two have in common? So you have Mark Zuckerberg, a 34-year-old working father, and my daughter, who's a freshman at the University of Michigan. Well, they're both called millennials, and yet we're having discussions about housing demand as if they and their high school classmates are both in the housing market together. So what we did was we actually broke the demographics down by year born and looked at it that way. And then what I've color-coded for you here is by decade born. So it's very easy. We all know what year we were born. We can compare 10-year periods to 10-year periods. And so what this allowed us to do was then get a much better handle on analyzing the demographics. And you could probably find your year on here, but the blue over here would be those born in the 1930s. We call them the savers. It's Warren Buffett's generation, and I'll have more on them in a minute. The green here is the beginning of the baby boom. You see that big spike right in the middle there, the 1940s. That was the start of the baby boom. We call them the achievers because they shifted society to be about making away from saving, more about making money and borrowing money to do so. The 1950s are in purple. That's the heart of the baby boom. We call those the innovators. That's Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and Ellen DeGeneres and Oprah Winfrey. Really hardworking, very competitive people. And you see now from 1950 on, every decade is 40 to 44 million in size. So this whole notion of a boom and a bust really is not a boom and a bust, primarily due to immigration. What this shaded piece here is Americans that were born in another country. And this bust here in the 1970s has been filled in. In fact, if you live in America and you were born in the 1970s, 23% of them were born in another country. So it's more of an even flow demographics going forward. In the orange is those born in the 1960s. We call them the equalers. The big shift there was equal education. Actually, that was the first time where more women graduated from college than men, and that trend has been accelerating ever since. Those born in the 1970s were actually the children of the early baby boomers who went through a 200% surge in the divorce rate. And that group said, I can see what happens when I'm dependent on somebody else and I don't have a college degree, so they continued the college education. And they shifted the definition of success away from making money to having more balance in life. And there's a lot of the charts. We wrote a whole book on this. It's called Big Shifts Ahead. In fact, this chart, I brought a copy of it for everybody so you can pass that around. It might be easier to see. And then you move to the millennials. And so when we have a discussion about millennial housing demand, I say, are you talking about those born in the 80s like Mark Zuckerberg? Or are you talking about those born in the 90s like my daughter? The teal color here is those born in the 80s. Thank you for that. They're out of the house. They've already formed 20 of their 24 million households. The millennial discussion about living with mom and dad is not very pertinent to them anymore. It's more pertinent to those born in the 90s. I call that group in the 1980s the sharers because the sharing economy that's disrupting everything was pretty much started by, all the companies were started by somebody born in the 80s. I think they're a very innovative crowd that have a lot in common with those born in the 1950s. And then those born in the 1990s, we call them the connectors because just like some of you there, they're connected to their phone 24/7. That's okay, I'm guilty of it too. They actually, but they were children during the Great Recession Just like Warren Buffett was a child during the Great Depression, and what they have in common is fear of debt. They're using debit cards, not credit cards. Now, I know they've got a lot of student debt and other things, but we're seeing history start to repeat itself with those born in the 80s being a lot like those born in the 50s, and those born in the 90s having some things in common with those born in the 1930s. So I wanted to give you the housing demand answer here. So if you just run the math, we have a tailwind behind us. We should see about 6% more renters coming into the market per year over the next 10 years, purely due to the numbers. We're in the midst of seeing an 11% increase in entry-level buyer activity, purely because there's more people born in the 80s than those born in the 1970s. This has been a big shift in the housing industry that some people haven't gotten completely through, because so many companies and so many product manufacturers were built on selling move-up homes to the baby boomers, but the demographics are now such that there's 7% fewer move-up buyers out there. So it's just, there is no growth at all in that demographic. You can still sell move-up homes because they're better than resale homes, but there's no growth. 2% growth in empty nesters. And then here's the real opportunity, 34% growth in the number of people turning 65 over the next 10 years. And the resale market was not built for those folks, so they're looking for something new, or they're looking to remodel their home that was built for families. So I'm going to give you one slide for each generation. So Warren Buffett's generation, the average GDP growth per person was 2.4% per person during the ages of 20 to 54 for 35 years. So the actual GDP was about a point higher than that. If you were born in the 1970s, you haven't seen half that growth. You've been in the workforce for 20 years, and the economy has not been growing as quickly. You can't expect them to get ahead and get the same home ownership when they haven't had the same economic growth. If you look at the early baby boomers born in the 1940s, they're the achievers, and how do you achieve? You grow your income and you reduce your expenses. You grow your income by increasing double income households, and you drop your biggest expense, so you go from having 3 children down to 2, and that's exactly what this generation did. This is the percentage of achievers. When they got into the workforce, 48% of moms were staying at home. That plummeted all the way down to 24%. When those balancers said, you know what, a rising percentage of us are going to stay at home now, and actually growing faster than this is the dad that is staying at home. Still more moms staying at home than dads, but the growth is in dads, because 58% of all college degrees now are going to women, so she's more likely to have the better job. Those born in the 1950s, the heart of the baby boom, they're the workaholics. We think 25% of them are going to continue working full-time into their late 60s. The math is trending that way. They were 6% more likely than the prior generation, or 7% more likely to work in their early 60s. We think that's going to continue. And then this has been a surprising trend. This is my generation, the equalers. So this is the percentage that rent. So it's the inverse of the home ownership rate. So it's been 20 to 23% of people aged 45 to 64 who've been renting. Look what happened over the last 10 years. And it ticked down a little bit. One of the things we're seeing is homeowners sell their home and become renters. And one of the things that I'm predicting is going to accelerate, particularly with the Tax Act when it kicks in, that people realize that their mortgage interest is no longer deductible because I'm getting a $24,000 standard deduction anyway, is just going to exacerbate the need to sell your home and rent. So almost 12% of America now rents a single-family home. And this was something that was really, the industry paid zero attention to until the Great Recession, when those Wall Street companies came in and started buying them up and made a big business out of it. One of the fastest growing parts of our business right now is feasibility studies on brand new built-for-rent new home communities. Detached, attached, all sorts of different products and sizes. I could do a whole presentation on that, but that is a growing trend from the demand side, and we're seeing it get built. And just to compare and contrast the two, there are 16 million single-family rental homes and 28 million people living in households living in apartments. So about twice as many in multifamily, but that's still a big number in single family. but single-family households make $10,000 a year more. Single-family households are much less likely to be under 35 and over 65. It's really that working crowd, 35 to 64. Single-family households, 38% of them are married, so it's not necessarily couples that are going into these homes. It's a lot of times it's singles. And 52% have kids versus 30% in apartments. So it's more likely to have kids, but I hear a generalization all the time. What's families in these single-family rental homes? Half the time, half of the homes don't even have kids in them. So moving on to those born in the 1970s that I call the balancers, this group had some tough luck. So they are in their early 30s or late 20s in the early 2000s. Subprime is going on, they're forming a family, it's the perfect time to purchase a home, it's easy to purchase a home. And at their 10-year high school reunion at the age of 28, they had a 42% home ownership rate, the highest ever at a 10-year high school reunion. Fast forward to their 20-year high school reunion. At my 20-year high school reunion, 63% of us had owned a home, they're 52. This is the foreclosure generation. So this move-up buyer profile I'm telling you about is also the one that really got hit the hardest by far during the Great Recession. Moving to the millennials, now they're the most college-educated generation ever, but they've got this to prove it. When the first one graduated from college, there was $260 billion in student debt. When the last one graduated, it was $1.38 trillion. So they're just walking around with this huge nut that's making it very hard to save for a down payment that counts against them when they're qualifying for a mortgage. And it was one of the reasons a lot of them did live at home to save some money and to pay down the student debt. Those younger millennials, though, are continuing a trend of being less likely to drive. And we spent a whole chapter, and I'm not going to get into it here, on urban versus suburban versus rural living. But one of the things they figured out is, hey, going urban, maybe my housing's more expensive, but my overall life isn't necessarily because I don't need a car. And so this is the percentage that are in their 20s who do not have a driver, or who do have a driver's license, about 79%, been trending down the whole time. So when you do the math on this, and you do it in 10-year periods, you're comparing apples and apples. And if anybody wants copies of the slides, just give me your card. I'll send them to you, or Lauren will send them to you too. All these generations that are the same size from the 50s on down, you know they're going to form 23 to 24 million households eventually. You can argue about the timing, but that's the number. What I'm showing here, though, is the number that are going to disappear over the next 10 years purely due to passing away or moving into assisted living facilities. And it's one of the things that is completely under-discussed in housing demand, is we're seeing a supply of homes come onto the market from people that are passing away. That baby boom is now starting to, we're seeing those born in the 1940s, we're going to lose 3.8 million households from people born in the 1940s over the next 10 years. And our math is we'll see about 26 million new households, which is kind of a normal number, something you would expect, but the net is 12.5 million. When you do the math, that's about 1.25 million housing units a year. You throw in replacement cost, and we think you need about 1.4 million housing units a year, which is about what we're doing right now. And a lot of people are complaining, when are we going to get back up to 1.8, 1.9, 2.0, because they're looking at the gross numbers coming in. They're not looking at this new supply that's coming on the market. And if you segment the growth, you say, well, of that 12.5 million, we're going to see about 3.3 million more people under 45. We're actually going to see fewer people aged 45 to 64. And this is pretty easy to forecast. This is just all of us getting a year older every year. But this is the opportunity, is the number of people who are going to age into the 65 plus, which I think is a huge opportunity for home builders and building products companies. So we tried to figure out all the reasons that were changing household formation and home ownership demand, and every question I was getting I could group into 4 buckets. It was either a government policy that was causing a change, something in the economy, a new technology like, hey, what is self-driving cars going to do to things, or some sort of societal shift like women more likely to have a child before they get married rather than the other way around. So what we did is we studied all of those, and we realized that the impact was very different depending on what age you are, which makes a lot of sense. So I'll show you the economy in a minute. It impacted people that were kids versus earlier in their career versus mid-career versus late career extremely differently. The same thing with self-driving cars. My generation is not going to give up their car. My kids may not be totally fine without a car. So you got to look at these policy shifts and these four disruptors by life stage to get to whatever question you're trying to ask for your business. So we call that the 4-5-6 rule. So let me give you an example. The Great Recession from 10 years ago. If you were born in the 1990s, you took a staycation, you saw what a Great Recession to you means foreclosures. If it wasn't to you, it was to somebody you knew. And so when they have the word recession now, people are automatically assuming foreclosures are coming, and it's making them very cautious. If you were born in the 1980s, you had just graduated from college with all that student debt, and there were no jobs to be had, and you ended up in retail with a poorly paying job with a good college degree, and really got a late start. If you were born in the 1970s, I show you what happened. You went from the highest home ownership at your 10 year to the lowest at your 20 year. That's the one that got hurt bad. But if you were born in the 50s or 40s, your 401k plunged and then it came roaring right back. That same recession had a very different impact on every single generation, and we need to look at that impact as we're building and selling homes to these folks. This is probably a little too wonky, so I'm going to just get straight to it. So this is by price range, under 300 grand, and then by $100,000 increments up to $1 million. The percentage of people that are paying all cash in green or putting more than 20% down. And you can see down in these lower price points where the heart of demand is, under 300 grand, about half of people a huge percentage are paying all cash. About half of people are putting 20% or more down. But let's look at who's putting down 10 to 20, 5 to 10, and less than 5. I mean, talk about a bifurcation in America, a third of people paying all cash and a third being able to put down less than 5%. That's what we're dealing with when we're selling homes. One of the things I'm paying the most attention to this year is mortgage policy, because 71% of mortgages are backed by the federal government, and everybody in charge of setting policy has just been replaced or is in the process of getting replaced. So to the extent your business involves home sales, 90% of it is financed with a mortgage, and 70% of those mortgages are going to get policy changes. So these 29% here are jumbos. They're pristine. They're fully documented. Everybody knows it's great FICO score, something down, and the banks are putting it on their balance sheet. That's not what I'm worried about. 46% is Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which is regulated by FHFA, and Mark Calabria was just appointed to replace Mel Watt to oversee all of that. And there's noise about them doing two things. One, getting it back into the public markets again as a publicly traded company. There'll have to be some policy shifts if they do that. On the same hand, it's also making a lot of money for Treasury, and they don't want to give that up either. So Mark Calabria is known as someone who wants to get the government out of the mortgage industry, so don't be surprised if we see some changes there. But this is the big one, so FHA. FHA is basically all of the loans now, all those low down payment loans I showed you, are all FHA. And the only people underwriting them are not banks, it's non-banks who are dotting every I and crossing every T and make, because that's what FHA requires, and they'll take the loan off their hands. Well, Brian Montgomery is the new FHA commissioner. He reports into Ben Carson, and there's a lot of pretty solid work done in DC. The FHA is taking a lot more risk than a private company would. So they're fine right now, but during the next downturn, it could get really ugly. So be careful watch carefully the policy changes here, because I don't think the administration wants homeownership to decline. They might even get looser, or they could get tighter, but that's going to determine housing demand. This is too detailed. I'm going to go through this one. Just at a high level, there's 4 C's to mortgages: credit, character, capacity, and collateral. The credit is the percentage of people to low FICO scores. we're pretty low. We're about 8% of the world under 640 is getting a FICO score. That's a normal back in the 90s would be 10, and it's a lot less than during the heydays. And the documentation is terrible, so it's horrendous. So when people say tight, I think low FICO and documentation, they're correct. However, capacity, Dodd-Frank said you should not make a loan above 42% of people, or all people's debt service, including their student debt loans, are more than 42% of their gross income, but we're going to exempt Fannie, Freddie, and FHA because it's 2010 and the housing market's in a recession. They're still exempt, and 43% of all mortgages are above that debt-to-income ratio, and 56% of all mortgages are putting down 10% or less. So those are both all-time highs. So the tightness is here, the looseness, it's not on the debt to income and down payment, extremely loose. I don't know which markets you're from, but this economic expansion has varied a lot. So one of the things that we're doing is we're helping our clients allocate capital around the country. If you're in Austin, Texas, you've got 35% more jobs today than you did in 2007. You're from Austin, Texas? I mean, there's no way you could house that number of people moving in. I'm from California, probably half of our state is on the way. Yeah, I know. Every time I'm in Austin, I recognize all the license plates from back home. But these have been the strongest housing markets, and they've had a ton of price appreciation because of this growth and the industry not able to keep up with it. These are actually some of the markets I'm most concerned about now because of the price appreciation. So I know I'll read it. Austin, Nashville, Dallas, San Antonio, Orlando, Denver are the ones all at the top. These are average. What's down here in orange, though, is some very interesting big housing markets that finally got their legs back under them after the Great Recession. The Tampas and the Las Vegases where we are today, and the Phoenixes. Those are actually some of the ones that we're most optimistic about because they're finally growing again. And then there's some of the California markets in Chicago and Philadelphia that really haven't recovered at all. So this, you talk about a national housing market, this is not a national housing market. It's very different by region. So my team does this every quarter, but they put a fun graphic together to show you where people are going. So we go to U-Haul's website and we price out renting a truck from one city to the other and then renting the exact same truck back, and you think they should be the same price, right? So to go from New York to Orlando is $2,872, and to take the same truck back, it's 75% cheaper. To go from Boston to Atlanta, it's $1,900, and to take the same truck back, it's $770. To go from DC to Nashville, $1,441, $578 back, so about 60–70% cheaper. Chicago to Phoenix, $2,200, $1,100 back. You can see everybody's heading south. Go pick on my market for a minute, Southern California. Los Angeles to Dallas, $2,800, less than $1,000 to take it back. LA to Phoenix, $1,100, $87 to take it back. I mean, if you're a good negotiator, I bet they would pay you to take it back, seriously. Because they're going to have to drive the truck back empty themselves, right? So this tells you what's going on demographically. And I should mention, because of the Tax Act, some of this stuff is starting to accelerate. So you're seeing more people from the Northeast finally throw in the towel, and California too, because it's really become much more expensive. You don't get all the tax deductions like you used to. So where's the growth going? Now, we did this before the Tax Act, so we haven't adjusted it, but we think about the Southeast, Texas, Florida, and the Southwest. From Nevada all the way down through Florida up through the Carolinas is where 42% of America lives, but that's where 62% of the growth has been going. And I think we're probably getting closer to 70% the way it's going right now. So if you want to follow the volume, go south. And then one of the other shifts I wanted to talk about was we call them DICE homebuyers, dual income college educated households. In 1970, right before Title IX was passed, 5% of couples had both gone to college. When I got married in 1990, it was 12%, and it's 23% today. This has caused a lot of confusion in the industry about entry-level buyers, particularly in the new home industry, because this is the growth in entry-level new home buyers. We're finding, and Nick from KTGY is designing a lot of great homes for people that are 32 years old. We both went to college. We make $200,000 a year. We're finally married and thinking about having a kid, and that's who's buying a house. And we're calling those entry-level buyers. But that's still the minority. It's about 23% of couples. And then one of the things we've done to take some of the math and humanize it a bit, because we really try to get down to the life stage by price point and what type of home should we be designing, we break the households up into categories. So young singles are about 10% of the home buyers in the country. Single parents are about 7% of the buyers. So they're a bigger percentage of households, but they're 7% of home buyers. And mature singles are 11%. So 28% of home buyers out there are single, but those are all probably looking for different things, right? And they've all got different financial resources as well. Moving on to couples, you've got about 5% of home buyers are young couples. 20% are empty nesters. So a lot of the home buying activity, frankly, is those people born in the 40s and 50s and maybe 60s who didn't get hurt as bad today by the Great Recession as others and are out buying their dream home. And active adults are about 14%. Those are over the age of 65. So only about 39% of home buyers are actually couples without kids in the house. Then you've got young families that are, 16%. Family plus, which we define to be having teens and younger kids in the house, is 9%. And then mature family would be just teens, would be about 8%. So about 33% families. So we're starting to look at demand this way, because I think that's how you need to look at demand, because that's how those people are looking at housing. And the greatest growth is right here, young couples and young families, as well as active adults. So that's where the biggest opportunities are. We partnered with a bunch of home builders, got them to blast their entire interest list, and we asked them like 150 questions, but we got about 23,000 answers to 80 of them. And we're going to do that again this year. And the questions were really about, what are you looking for in a house? What are you trying to, would you pay more for this, or would you pay more for that? And some pretty interesting responses if you want to talk about it later. In fact, Jenny Lance, who's with me, was in charge of that. So when we boil it all down, we think we're going to lose about 10.6 million homeowners. Nobody talks about that, but those 13.3 million households that are going to pass away or move into assisted living have an 80% homeownership rate. So those are all homes that are coming on the market. And we're probably going to pick up about 16 million more homeowners. So that's a lot more homeowners, but the net is about 530,000 a year. It's not a ton of growth, but it is positive. And I think I want to just end on this one last piece, is I wanted to throw up here, these are the 19 publicly traded home builders. 18 of them have an average sales price above 300 grand, and 11 of them have an average sales price above 400 grand. And some of these, like KB Home, are known for building entry-level homes, and they're now above $400,000. What's holding back construction, frankly, is this, because the demand is down around 250. I work for all of these guys. They would build a lot more homes at 250 if they could make money at a normal margin to do so, and they just can't. And the issues primarily are things that they can't fix. It's mostly local government regulations. So I do think we're going to be stuck in a while for not a lot of growth in the industry because of the price point. So with that was our demographic look at housing, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And I didn't learn a thing listening to myself, so if you disagree with something too, I'd love to hear that, because then I'll learn. Yes? Yeah. So the question was about the severe winters in the north, and the woman who runs Florida for me has said, every year that's a severe winter in the Northeast, they have a better year in Florida. Conversely, every time they have a bad hurricane year in Florida, they have a worse, actually Carolinas pick up, because people go south but not all the way, halfway back, right, halfbacks. Yeah. Yeah, so the question was about growth and income. We need to do more work on that. There's a lot of people, frankly, it's very interesting to me, who I don't think are even asking for raises. This is holding things down. There's also something in the data about 65-year-olds dropping out of the workforce, making 100 grand and being replaced by a 30-year-old who's making 50, but maybe got a raise from 45 to 50, so he or she's happy. So that you're right that the data is not showing a lot of growth, but in some sectors in Korea, and particularly in Austin, Texas, in the tech sector, I think there's some really strong income growth. So it kind of depends on the sector. Those are good questions. We need to do more work on the income growth because it's really stratified. All right, well, thank Owens Corning for having us. It was nice to get the questions. And you bet.